This video contains a truth that has changed the lives of many. And if you've ever felt lost, stuck in routine, or like life had quietly passed you by, then this story is for you. Because sometimes what changes your life isn't a grand event. It's a moment, a decision, a door you open, not knowing what's waiting on the other side. Frank was 62, a widower, a quiet man who had grown used to silence. Each morning, he followed the same rhythm. Wake up, brew coffee, take out the trash. It wasn't a life of sadness exactly, but of stillness. A life that had stopped moving the day she left. That morning seemed no different. The sky was pale, the wind barely whispered. And as Frank pushed open the back door, he expected nothing more than a breeze and the creak of old wood beneath his slippers. But what he found would change everything. There, right outside his door, was a bundle. Old cloth, torn and dirty, lying still on the porch. At first, he thought it was trash, something the wind had carried in, but then it moved, just slightly, enough for him to see the shape of something breathing. And then, two eyes opened, software dark, trembling with fear, a dog, small, starving, hurt. Its leg was scraped raw, fur matted, ribs showing through the skin, but it didn't growl, it didn't bark, it just stared, as if asking for something. Frank froze. 1,000 excuses flooded his mind. He didn't have time. He didn't want the responsibility. He hadn't let anything new into his life since she passed. But those eyes. There was a story behind them, a question, and a quiet, desperate hope. Frank didn't know it yet, but this wasn't just a stray dog on his porch. It was the beginning of something extraordinary. This video contains a truth that has changed the lives of many. And if you've ever felt lost, stuck in routine, or like life had quietly passed you by, then this story is for you. Because sometimes what changes your life isn't a grand event. It's a moment, a decision, a door you open, not knowing what's waiting on the other side. Frank was 62, a widower, a quiet man who had grown used to silence. Each morning, he followed the same rhythm. Wake up, brew coffee, take out the trash. It wasn't a life of sadness exactly, but of stillness. A life that had stopped moving the day she left. That morning seemed no different. The sky was pale, the wind barely whispered. And as Frank pushed open the back door, he expected nothing more than a breeze and the creak of old wood beneath his slippers. But what he found would change everything. There, right outside his door, was a bundle. Old cloth, torn and dirty, lying still on the porch. At first, he thought it was trash, something the wind had carried in, but then it moved, just slightly, enough for him to see the shape of something breathing. And then, two eyes opened, software dark, trembling with fear, a dog, small, starving, hurt. Its leg was scraped raw, fur matted, ribs showing through the skin, but it didn't growl, it didn't bark, it just stared, as if asking for something. Frank froze. 1,000 excuses flooded his mind. He didn't have time. He didn't want the responsibility. He hadn't let anything new into his life since she passed. But those eyes. There was a story behind them, a question, and a quiet, desperate hope. Frank didn't know it yet, but this wasn't just a stray dog on his porch. It was the beginning of something extraordinary. Frank stepped onto the porch, his body stiff from years of quiet living, but his eyes locked on the creature in front of him. The closer he got, the more clearly he could see the dog's condition. Its sides heaved with shallow breaths. Its fur was matted with dirt and dried blood, and its eyes, wide and glassy, never looked away. He knelt slowly, trying not to frighten it. Up close, it was even smaller than he'd thought. A pup, maybe a year old, malnourished, wounded, fragile in a way that struck Frank in his chest. He set the garbage bag down and reached out with the same care he once used when holding his wife's hand during her last days. "It's okay," he whispered. "You're safe now." The dog didn't flinch, it just stared. Frank didn't know much about animals. He'd never owned a dog. His wife, Ellen, had wanted one, but after she passed 5 years ago, Frank had shut that door, literally and figuratively. His world had become quiet, predictable, safe. He had his books, his coffee, the sound of the wind brushing through the old trees outside his home. That was enough, or so he had told himself. But now, here was this little thing, barely alive, left on his porch. A question he didn't ask for, a need he didn't expect. He sighed and stood up, joints cracking. He stepped inside, returned moments later with a towel and a bowl of warm water. Carefully, slowly, he began to clean the dog's paw, revealing the raw wound beneath the crusted mud. The dog let him. It didn't move. It didn't growl. It simply trusted. He wrapped it gently in the towel and sat down beside it. Silence filled the air, heavy and soft. The forest beyond the porch was still cloaked in early morning mist, the trail winding off into a quiet unknown. Frank glanced down at the bundle next to him. "Well," he muttered, "guess we both didn't plan on company today." The dog blinked, one ear twitching. Frank leaned back against the wooden post, exhaling slow and deep. He didn't know what came next, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like the day might hold something different, something worth staying awake for. That night, Frank barely slept. He had made up a bed for the dog, just an old pillow and a blanket by the fireplace, but the quiet sound of its breathing kept drawing his attention. Every time he turned over in bed, he found himself listening for that rhythm, afraid it might stop. At dawn, he padded down the hall and peeked into the living room. The dog was still curled up, barely stirring, but its eyes opened when it sensed him nearby. Not frightened, just tired. He brewed coffee, made a slice of toast, and then stared at the second plate in his hand for a long moment. Finally, he broke off half the toast and placed it on a paper towel near the dog's blanket. It didn't eat at first. It just stared at him. Then, slowly, it inched forward and took a bite. That was the moment Frank decided to call the local vet. An hour later, he was in his old pickup truck, the dog wrapped in a blanket beside him on the passenger's seat. It didn't make a sound, didn't fidget, just sat there quietly like it somehow knew. This man had become its only hope. The vet's office was small, family-run. Dr. Maynard, a kind woman in her 50s with streaks of silver in her braid, gently lifted the dog onto the table. "She's a fighter," she said after a thorough exam. "Looks like she's been through a lot. Possibly dumped, maybe injured from a trap or rough terrain. But nothing's broken. She just needs rest, food, and someone who cares." Frank nodded slowly. "I'm not really a dog person." Dr. Maynard just smiled, scribbling notes. "Funny, that dog hasn't taken her eyes off you since you walked in." Frank looked down. The dog, her, was indeed staring at him. Not with fear, not with pain, but with quiet trust. He felt something catch in his chest, that tight place that hadn't softened in years. And just like that, a name slipped from his lips. "Shadow," he whispered. The days that followed were quiet, but different. Shadow now had a spot near the fireplace, complete with an old fleece blanket and a shallow bowl that Frank kept clean and full. She moved slowly at first, her steps cautious and unsure, but she followed him, always, to the kitchen, to the garden. Even when he sat on the porch to drink his morning coffee, she'd lie just beside him, eyes half closed, like she was afraid he might disappear. Frank didn't say much to her at first, but the silence between them began to shift. He started mumbling little things, comments about the weather, remarks about the mail being late. He didn't realize he was talking to her until one afternoon when he looked down and said, "Looks like rain again, huh?" And Shadow's ears perked up like she understood every word. That made him chuckle. The sound surprised even himself. As the days stretched into weeks, Shadow began to heal, physically and otherwise. Her fur began to soften, her eyes grew brighter, and she even started wagging her tail when Frank walked in the room. But something else began to heal, too. Frank started sleeping through the night. He no longer woke to the empty side of the bed or the echo of his wife's absence. Instead, he woke to a quiet breath, a stretch of pause, and a warm presence that had made its way to the foot of his bed. And for the first time in years, he didn't mind. One crisp morning, Frank took Shadow for her first walk down the gravel path behind the house. The trees were shedding gold and red, and the sky stretched wide and calm. Shadow walked slowly at his side, her steps careful, but her head held higher than ever. At one point, Frank stopped to catch his breath. He looked down. Shadow looked up. "I didn't save you," he murmured, voice rough with emotion. "You saved me." She pressed her head gently into his hand, as if to say, "I know." And in that quiet forest, surrounded by falling leaves and second chances, Frank finally allowed himself to believe that maybe healing doesn't always come with time. Sometimes it comes with 4 legs and a second chance at love. Autumn came quickly that year. The wind grew sharper, leaves fell faster, and Frank started bundling up in heavier coats during his morning walks with Shadow. They had slipped into a rhythm, 2 quiet souls moving through the days side by side. The neighbors had begun to notice, too. People who hadn't seen Frank smile in years now waved as he passed, with a black and brown blur trotting faithfully beside him. But on a cold Sunday morning, everything changed. They had gone farther than usual, down past the river trail, where the old bridge had collapsed years ago. Frank wasn't worried. Shadow had grown stronger, braver, and besides, this walk had become their favorite part of the day. Until he tripped. It happened so fast. One moment he was steady, gravel crunching beneath his boots. Then suddenly his foot caught on a root, and he went down hard. The pain in his hip was immediate and blinding. He gasped, tried to move, but his leg wouldn't respond. He was alone. No phone. No one around for miles. Shadow barked. Once. Twice. She circled him, nuzzled his face, whined with panic. "Go," Frank whispered, his voice shaking. "Go get help." But Shadow didn't leave. Instead, she pressed her body against his chest, keeping him warm against the biting wind. She barked again, louder this time, head thrown back toward the trees. Then she looked at him, one last look, and darted off down the trail. Frank lay there, the cold settling into his bones. Minutes passed, then an hour. Shadows shifted in the trees above, and just when his eyes began to close, footsteps. 2 hikers appeared out of nowhere, led by a barking blur of fur. There he is," they called for help. One wrapped Frank in a thermal blanket, while the other kept Shadow close, whispering, "Good girl, good girl." In the ambulance, Frank's fingers found her paw. "You came back. he whispered, eyes wet. She didn't bark, didn't whine. She just leaned into his hand. In that moment, Frank knew. This wasn't just a rescue story. It was a bond, one built not out of convenience, but out of survival, loyalty, and love. Recovery was slow, but peaceful. Frank stayed in the hospital for nearly a week. Nothing broken, but a bad sprain and mild hypothermia meant he had to rest. And for once, he listened. But he wasn't alone. Not really. Every day, the nurses smiled as Shadow padded in through the automatic doors, tail wagging, leash loosely held by a neighbor. She'd hop onto the chair by his bed, curl up, and rest her chin on his arm. "She's got better bedside manners than half our staff," one nurse laughed. Frank just smiled. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. Once back home, things felt different. The house didn't feel so quiet anymore. The silence had changed. Now it was filled with small, comforting sounds. Paws tapping across the wood floor, the jingle of Shadow's collar, the deep sigh she let out when she curled up beside him by the fire. And Frank, he changed too. He joined a local animal shelter as a volunteer. Once a week at first, then more often. He didn't do much, just walked the dogs, cleaned up, offered quiet company. But he was steady, reliable, and people noticed. One day, a little boy came in with his foster parents, too shy to speak. He sat alone by the kennel doors, eyes downcast, shoulders tight. Frank sat beside him without a word. Shadow trotted over, gently nudged the boy's hand. The boy smiled. "You thinking about taking one home?" Frank asked softly. The boy nodded. "I want one like her." Frank's heart swelled. Shadow had come into his life by accident, or maybe not. Maybe she was meant to show up when he needed her most. Maybe saving her wasn't the end of the story. Maybe it was the beginning. That night, as they sat on the porch beneath the stars, Frank whispered, "You changed me, girl." Shadow laid her head on his knee, eyes closing peacefully. Sometimes love doesn't arrive with fireworks or fanfare. Sometimes it shows up quietly, curled in a blanket on your porch, waiting to be let in. A few months passed, and life settled into a peaceful rhythm again. Frank and Shadow took their morning walks a little slower now. He wasn't as steady on his feet since the fall, and she seemed to understand, matching his pace, always glancing up as if checking in. Then one day in early spring, something unusual happened. Frank was brushing Shadow's coat in the backyard, enjoying the warmth of the afternoon sun, when his hand paused at the back of her neck. Beneath the fur, his fingers felt something hard, small, round. He parted the hair and found a worn leather collar, hidden under the layers of her growing fur. The buckle was rusted, but still intact, and hanging from it, a scratched metal tag. Frank turned it over. One side was blank. The other read, Maggie, 706-4. The rest had faded with time and weather. Frank sat back on the porch steps, stunned. Shadow, Maggie, had once belonged to someone. She wasn't born in the wild. She wasn't just a stray. She had a name, a home. And somewhere along the line, she'd been lost. He looked at her. She was lying in the grass, eyes closed, basking in the sun. Peaceful, trusting. She didn't know he'd found her secret. Or maybe she did. Maybe she'd been waiting for him to find it. For a brief moment, Frank felt torn. Should he try to find her old owner? What if someone had been searching for her all this time? That night, he sat with a cup of tea in one hand, the collar in the other, and watched Shadow sleeping by the fire. "She's not Maggie anymore," he whispered to the empty room. "She's home." Still, He couldn't shake the feeling. So the next morning, he made a few calls. The search wasn't long. The area code belonged to a small town 2 hours away. With help from the local shelter and a few online records, he eventually reached a woman in her 70s named Ruth. And when she picked up the phone, her voice trembled. "Maggie, you found my Maggie." Frank sat in his truck, parked under the shade of an old oak, staring at the house across the street. It was a modest place, white fence, wind chimes on the porch, a flower bed in full bloom. Peaceful, familiar. A woman stood by the front steps, her hands twisting nervously, eyes fixed on the road. Shadow, Maggie, was beside him in the passenger seat. Her head rested on Frank's knee, eyes half closed, calm as ever. She didn't know where they were, didn't know who was waiting. He'd spoken to Ruth on the phone twice now. She was kind, gentle. Her voice cracked when she spoke of losing Maggie 2 years ago. How the gate had been left open during a thunderstorm. How they'd searched for weeks. And how, eventually, they gave up, thinking the worst. And now here, Frank was. He looked down at Shadow, her chest rising and falling in that familiar rhythm. She'd been with him through cold nights, long silences, near death and rebirth. She was more than a dog now. She was family. But was he ready to take that from someone else? He exhaled slowly, opened the door, and stepped out. Shadow followed, tail low, ears curious. Ruth approached with tears already in her eyes. The moment she saw Shadow, she stopped, hands covering her mouth. "Maggie," she whispered. Shadow tilted her head. Frank loosened the leash. Shadow stepped forward, cautiously, sniffed the air, and then, slowly, walked up to Ruth. Their eyes met. Ruth knelt. Shadow leaned in, but only for a moment. Then she turned her head, looked back at Frank. It wasn't rejection. It wasn't confusion. It was clarity, as if to say, "I remember her, but I choose you." Ruth smiled through her tears. "She remembers me, but I think she's yours now." Frank swallowed hard. "Are you sure?" Ruth nodded. "She came back to life with you. That's what matters." They sat together on the porch for a while, the three of them. No rush, no pressure, just quiet understanding. When Frank stood to leave, Ruth placed a hand on his arm. "Take good care of her," she said gently. Frank smiled. "She's taking care of me." Years passed, quietly, softly. Shadow had grown slower, but still followed Frank like his own shadow, as she always had. Her fur had gone gray around the muzzle, and her eyes clouded slightly with age, but her devotion never faded. And Frank? He had changed too. The man who once lived in silence now carried stories. He told them at the shelter on Saturdays, where he volunteered with rescued dogs. He shared them with neighbors, with children who came to meet the animals, and sometimes, just in whispers, to Shadow herself, as they sat on the porch watching the sun fall behind the trees. One late autumn evening, Frank sat by the fireplace, a mug of tea in his hand and a letter on his lap. His handwriting had gotten slower, more careful. The title at the top read, "What She Gave Me." They say a man's life is made up of chapters, some loud, some quiet, some you don't want to read again. For a long time, I thought my story was over. But one cold morning, I opened a door, and everything changed. I found a dog, or maybe she found me. She didn't have much, just broken bones, tired eyes, and a name long forgotten. But what she gave me was more than rescue. She gave me purpose. She gave me company. She gave me mornings worth waking up for. If you've ever felt alone, I promise you, love still finds us. often when we least expect it, often when we're not even looking. All you have to do is open the door. Frank passed away quietly one winter morning. Peaceful. Shadow was by his side, as always. At the shelter, his letter was framed and placed at the entrance. Visitors often paused to read it, some smiling, some wiping away a tear. Above it was a simple sign, in memory of Frank and Shadow, a reminder that rescue is always mutual. And their story lived on, not just in words, but in every dog adopted, every lonely heart opened, every porch light left on, just in case love showed up unexpectedly. If this story moved you, don't keep it to yourself. Subscribe to the channel to hear more real stories like Frank and Shadow's. Stories about healing, second chances, and the bonds that change our lives. And in the comments, share with us, what did this story teach you? Because sometimes the stories we share become the strength someone else needs.